Now, for more on this topic, I spoke with former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg in the last hour. Josh, thank you so much for being here. You've been front and centre these past 2 years. How are you feeling today after the release of the remaining living hostages?
Well, Shari, like everyone, I'm feeling an enormous sense of relief. It's as if a dark cloud has been lifted that has hovered for the last 2 years, and one couldn't help but shed a tear at the sights of jubilation with the families being reunited with their loved ones. But there's also, a deep sense of sadness, given the level of destruction and devastation and death that we've seen over the last 2 years, and particularly the barbarity of October the 7th itself. But I can't but help feel hopeful about the future following the president's speech to the Knesset, but also the gathering of world leaders in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt that have signed on to this peace plan. So yes, there is uncertainty as to what will unfold in the months and years ahead, but certainly I'm the most hopeful I have been for some time.
No, it was such a beautiful sight to see all those loving families. I agree, there's a lot of hope today. You just referred to the peace agreement in Egypt, and Trump's message is that this is now a time for peace. But how great of a challenge will this next phase be of disarming Hamas? We know their intent on destroying Israel, and then also finding an independent new governing body.
Well, it's a very steep hill to climb, but if anyone can climb it, I think the President of the United States can, and he seems to be fully committed to it, and it's going to define his presidency in many ways, certainly in terms of the foreign policy results that he's able to achieve. The hard work, though, begins now, as you say, disarming Hamas, which shows no intent of wanting to do that, at least voluntarily. We must rebuild Gaza because it is, the site of enormous devastation, and people deserve to have a fresh start there. And critically, you need proper governance and an education system that doesn't reward terror, that doesn't incite violence, that doesn't pay to slay, that doesn't, teach kids that Israel and Jews are the enemy, basically from the day of their of their early schooling, the first day of their early schooling, and that's what we had seen in Gaza up till now. So there is an opportunity, and I think the president's got significant runway. He's got another 3 and a bit years of his term to run. He's certainly got enormous leverage over the key Muslim and Arab countries. We know that Egypt is the second largest recipient of US aid. We know that Qatar looks to the United States for a security guarantee, particularly after the Israeli attack on Hamas officials in Doha. And then, of course, Turkey is public about wanting the latest American weapon systems. So these countries that have influence over Hamas have been brought to the table by an American president who's willing to use that leverage. And of course, the president has leverage with Israel, and Israel has paid a high price by handing over prisoners, 250 of whom were facing life sentences for murder in return for the hostages who had been brutally treated in the dungeons of Gaza. And that was a hard deal, but one that I'm sure every Prime Minister of Israel would take because the focus is on the life of those Israeli hostages who were being held for so long.
Exactly. I also want to ask you about the role of Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong. They claim they played a role in building momentum for peace by recognising a Palestinian state. Should they be taking credit for Trump's peace plan?
Oh, it's insulting in the extreme, Shari, for Australia to be claiming credit for what has transpired over the last 24 hours. Credit is due to the President of the United States, and it's wrong, it's offensive, and it doesn't withstand a second of scrutiny. And as I've written I think, Penny Wong should be condemned for taking a victory lap over Donald Trump's finishing line. The reality
Great
is
line, by the way. Great line and spot on.
Well, the reality, Shari, is from day one. Penny Wong, after the attack on October the 7th, was publicly calling for Israel's restraint before Israel had even militarily responded to that attack, and certainly before the blood of the Israeli victims were even dry. And then from there, Australia was supporting ceasefire resolutions in the UN that didn't even mention Hamas or didn't even mention the hostages, and certainly did not support Israel going into those places in Rafah and Gaza City where the hostages were. And then you had the International Criminal Court engage in a immoral act of lawfare by putting Israeli democratically elected leaders who had been attacked on October the 7th on the same pedestal as the terrorist organisation Hamas that had attacked on October the 7th. Yet Australia did not speak up and should be condemned from that. And then, of course, as you referred to, Australia recognised Palestinian statehood while the hostages were still in the dungeons of Gaza and while Hamas was still in control. And that was condemned by the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who said it was being done for domestic political purposes, which it was, but also that the only impact of it would be to embolden Hamas. So it's just obvious that Australia has not played any meaningful or positive role in getting to the result that we saw yesterday. And how, for the life of me, Australia could pat itself on the back, or at least the Albanese government could pat itself on the back, for being praised by the terrorists of Hamas who threaten our security, while simultaneously being condemned by the US Secretary of State and the United States, which guarantee our security, is really, a question that they must be held accountable for.
Josh, just finally, you've been a great leader on the rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. Now that there's a ceasefire, are these weekly pro-Palestinian protests with their hateful chants still necessary? I mean, what are they actually protesting?
Well, absolutely, they're not necessary. And it's pretty telling, isn't it, that as a ceasefire was put in place and the hostages were released, that the pro-Palestinian protesters were silent in terms of welcoming what was an end to the fighting and an end to the war. I've said all along, Shari, that these daily and weekly protests around the country are incubators of hate. We have seen members of parliament, members of Albanese's government marching under the banner of the Ayatollah in Iran. We have seen people holding up signs saying Zionists are terrorists, Jews are Nazis, waving the flags of listed terrorist organisations, Hamas and Hezbollah, saying death to the IDF and from the river to the sea. These protests are incubators of hate, and they've divided our society, not united our society. And where were those protesters when there was widespread devastation and destruction and killing in the Sudan, in Yemen, or indeed in Syria? They were nowhere to be seen. And that exposes the double standards and the hypocrisy of them. But at the same time, just yesterday, we heard from the Chief Commissioner of Police in Victoria that as a result of these protests in Melbourne, 25,000 police shifts have been required. And in his words, Shari, if half of those shifts could have been dedicated to fighting crime, we wouldn't see the wave of crime that we've seen in Melbourne. So I think any decent-minded, well-meaning Australian would say, now that the war seems to be at an end, it's time that these protests come to an end. And that's in the interests of social cohesion, but it's also in the interests of community safety. because on both counts, these protests have undermined what is good and what is proper for Australia, namely social cohesion and community safety.
Really important message there, Josh. Thank you so much for joining us and, of course, for your incredible leadership over the past 2 years. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.